Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. Oh, someone's just here. Let me get them to introduce themselves. Tell us something about you.
I've killed women and children. Killed just about everything that walks or crawled at one time or another. And I'm here to kill you.
Holy sh!
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, given away by the title, really, I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, marketing stories, release stories, production stories, all the ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. Now, the movies I tend to cover in this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is strictly a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that some people somehow manage to get films made. Without further ado then, with all that preamble done, I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode. We're going to go back to 1997 for this one. Let me play you a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
In 1977, a kid from nowhere.
Maybe think about your name.
My name, yeah.
Something a little pizzazz.
Dirk Diggler. Good name. I like your name a lot.
Had a dream of getting somewhere.
Jack Horner has found something special in newcomer Dirk Diggler.
So let me just pop in this 8-track, and you just give a listen and tell me what you think, okay?
It was a time when disco was king.
These are the ones. These are great.
Yeah, those are really cool. Are they lizard?
No, they're Italian.
Do you like my shoes?
They're pretty cool.
Sex was safe.
Woo-hoo!
Pleasure was a business.
Cut. Terrific. Nice work.
And business was booming.
And the award for Best Newcomer goes to Mr. Dirk Diggler.
Wow.
Well, wow indeed. That was a clip from 1997's Boogie Nights, written and directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, and with a huge ensemble cast including Mark Wahlberg, Julianne Moore, Burt Reynolds, Don Cheadle, John C. Reilly, William H. Macy, Heather Graham, Nicole Parker, and the late, great Philip Seymour Hoffman. And so Paul Thomas Anderson, at this stage in his career, was in his 20s when he made this film, but it wasn't his first film. His first movie was originally entitled Sydney, and that one starred Philip Baker Hall, who you also see in Boogie Nights and Anderson's subsequent Magnolia as well. And this was done for Rideshare Entertainment, but he was 26 when he made Sydney. It was released as Hard 8, and it would be one of the lowest grossing movies of its particular year. And the story of the making of it turned out not to be a happy one for Anderson, because the production company involved was very, let's just say, disagreeing with Anderson over the overall direction of the movie. It changed the title, it changed the final cut, and in the end Anderson was ultimately fired from the movie. And it's only in more recent times that Hard 8 has had some degree of reappraisal in the context of the success that Anderson has had since. Now, Anderson himself, I mean, he was a teenager in the 1980s, growing up in the San Fernando Valley area of Los Angeles. I mean, we've seen him explore this on screen more recently in the film Licorice Pizza. And as he grew up, he would sneak onto movie sets. He would follow the work of his father, Ernie, a voiceover artist, and be able to get access to bits and bobs of film and TV. And he was enamoured with the industry. He was enamoured with the area, and he had an insight into how films worked. And so he was making his own short movies in his teens. And as he told reporter Sharon Waxman in her excellent book, Rebels on the Backlot, which I hugely recommend, there was a turning point, really, in that he found his father's, quote, stash of porn at the age of 9 and watched it obsessively through his teens. And every chance he got, Anderson would sneak a look at movies such as the opening of Misty Beethoven, which I confess I haven't covered on this podcast to date. Now, he would channel let's just say some of his responses to this, I'm treading carefully, into a short movie called The Dirk Diggler Story. Now, this turned out to be a much talked about in the end short film based on a documentary about a former adult actor called John Holmes. But coming off the back of Sydney and also working with the Filmmakers Lab at the Sundance Film Institute, he now looked back at that Dirk Diggler story and thought about turning it into a longer film. That he'd been doing some work on that and he'd been expanding the narrative of it. And the story goes too that when he was at Sundance working on the film, he would, and this comes from Sharon Waxman's book as well, he would stay up late at night and he would be watching adult films with the projectionist who was working as part of Robert Redford's Sundance Institute. Now, one of the key responses he had to Sydney is his next film he was going to do very, very much on his own terms, that he'd been messed over once, he'd learned his lesson, and so this time around it was going to be different. And so he completed his screenplay for the film that would become Boogie Nights, and in 1996 this made it to an executive at New Line Cinema by the name of Michael DeLuca. Now, again, going back to Rebels on the Backlot, it was described in there as the script was like nothing DeLuca had ever seen before, and it was the kind of project that was right up his street as well. Now, it was problematic. The script that Anderson had written was 185 pages, which suggested a 3-hour film, and also the material was in and around the adult film industry. Now, this is not the kind of thing that was likely to attract star talent to the films, and also it was likely to make it more difficult to bring in actors and members of the crew. Yet DeLuca felt the script was brilliant. And in a big retrospective article that was done over at Grantland a few years ago, Anderson himself explained, "I saw the San Fernando Valley the way David Lean saw the desert in Lawrence of Arabia." And so DeLuca took a look at it and really started to vouch for it. And it had helped Anderson's cause, really, that he'd recently passed on a film called Kids that had gone on to be an indie hit. And DeLuca felt that's just the kind of edgy material they should be making. And there's a feeling that that one just kind of slipped through its fingers a little bit. Also, New Line was at an interesting point, just as the independent film industry was at an interesting point. So it hadn't been fully acquired by Warner Brothers at this stage. It had just had a string of hits in the mid-1990s as well. Films like The Mask and Seven and Dumb and Dumber had brought serious change into the New Line coffers. But also, there was a ripple-down effect across Hollywood of the success of Quentin Tarantino's 1994 movie Pulp Fiction. That Pulp Fiction hadn't cost an awful lot of money to make, had comfortably made 9 figures at the box office, had won Oscars, and was guaranteed to be making money for its financiers for pretty much all time, as has proven the case. And New Line wanted a little bit of that, as every other studio wanted a little bit of that. Why can't we find a low-budget, indie, edgy, awards magnet film that will keep making money for us? And so DeLuca felt that Boogie Nights might be it, and he took the script, the very heavy script, to his bosses, Michael Lynn and Bob Shea at New Line at the time. He wanted it, and interestingly, Paul Thomas Anderson's agent knew that this was a tricky sell. He hadn't sent the script around to too many people because to a bunch of people there's just no point whatsoever. The subject matter considerably narrowed who would make it. Now, for New Line, which still wasn't paying silly money for project, this worked in its favour because as much as it wanted to be interested in making independent art films, it didn't want to be getting into bidding wars for them. And so it helped in this case that there wasn't a lot of competition for the Boogie Nights project. And New Line, in truth as well, was hardly biting Paul Thomas Anderson's arm off. In fact, as Bob Shea would tell that Grantland article, it was a great subject, it had interesting characters, but it was ridiculously long, the script I'm talking about, and the way it was characterised with Dirk Diggler's 13-inch penis was questionable. I don't think he said that sentence too many times in his life. And he was questioning, how on earth are we going to put that on screen? How do we depict that? However, New Line was still interested, and Anderson was completing his script and he was moving the project forward. And so it kind of came to a put up or shut up moment for the film, that there was enough interest within New Line. But, and also Michael DeLuca was really pushing for this as well. But if New Line was going to go forward with it, and Anderson met the executives who weren't entirely sold on him originally, there were going to be conditions. I mean, as hard-nosed as Anderson was going to be about his film, there were areas that New Line wouldn't budge. And the studio gave him 2 options. Anderson basically wanted both an NC-17 rating for his film and for it to be over 3 hours long. And the 2 options that New Line presented, well, you can have one or the other. Now, New Line knew that NC-17 was commercial poison. It meant that in America, no one under 17 could see it. It was bizarre we had this chat. But it also meant that in came the moral crusades, and thus big multiplexes would not show the film. Big video stores that still had a lot of power at this point would not stock the film. And so they needed an R rating, really, to give it any chance of some commercial viability. The problem is the Motion Picture Association of America, that gives out ratings in the US, is notoriously intolerant of nookie. It will happily watch you slash your arms off and shoot people in the head, but if anyone even thinks of taking their trousers off in the middle of a film, the ratings, I've not been in the ratings room, but I'd like to think it's characterised by a lot of tuts. Now, given the content and the nature of the screenplay that Anderson had written, the chances of this not causing problems with the MPAA were very much on the slim side. Also, Anderson had written this 185-page script. He could have one or the other. And so in the end, what he decided to go for, because he kind of realised he was going to have to give something here, he decided he'd go with the R rating. And he saw that as a degree of a challenge. So he was going to have his 3-hour film. However, it was going to be R rated as mandated by New Line Cinema. New Line thus agreed to put up the money for it. It was going to pay $15 million, which a fair amount of money when you consider just how risky a project this was, and also the fact that a 20-something second-time director whose first film had been a significant box office failure was going to get pretty much complete creative control over the film. Anderson had his deal, he had his film, and I do think it was some of the trickle down from Pulp Fiction that helped get this over the line, and he could get on with the small matter of casting the movie. So, for the lead role of Dirk Diggler, a very, very well-endowed adult movie star, there were two main candidates it came down to that Anderson had seen in the film The Basketball Diaries, a really good film well worth seeking out. And one of the key stars of that movie was Leonardo DiCaprio. Now, DiCaprio was offered Boogie Nights, he was offered the role of Dirk Diggler, but he was also toying with an offer from James Cameron for the movie Titanic, and perhaps wisely for the state of his career, he did take the Titanic job on instead, which brought Mark Wahlberg into focus. Now, Wahlberg at this stage in his career was not known as an actor. He was a music star. He was a man who modelled pants in the British sense of the word. But if you wanted him as a serious dramatic actor, he would not be your obvious choice. And in fact, Wahlberg himself wasn't, he was a little bit up and down when he first got the script. He knew it was going to be a risky project. And also, all of Hollywood was alert to what had happened to the last adult slanted movie in this kind of area. That was Paul Verhoeven's Showgirls, which had been a notable box office flop. That's one that's kind of redeemed itself through cult following since. But why, if you were looking to be a serious actor, would you follow the path of Showgirls and do a project that looked like that? But Wahlberg read the script, and as he told Grantland, I got 35 pages into it. I put it down and I said, I've got to meet the director. He said, this guy either finally wants me to take the Calvin Kleins off, or he wants to make a really serious movie. And they did meet. And in the end, Wahlberg was persuaded to sign on the dotted line, and the role of Dirk Diggler was filled. Now, Julianne Moore also takes a key role in this. Now, she had a relationship with DeLuca, and that's how she got hold of the screenplay for it. She read it, devoured it, and really, really wanted in. But in terms of the rest of the ensemble, there's a character called Roller Girl in the movie. If you've not had the pleasure of the film, she goes around on roller skates pretty much the entire film, not wearing an awful lot of clothes. And again, there weren't that many leading women in Hollywood who were particularly keen to put themselves forward for it. There was a story that Drew Barrymore toyed with the part for a little while, that Tatum O'Neal came in and did an audition, but it was this nudity, the explicitity of it, that was putting people off. And in the end, it was Heather Graham who came in and landed that part. William H. Macy was sent the script. He saw an even more explicit draft than the final version of the film, got it from his agent, and he thought his agent was just playing some kind of trick on him. But his agent assured him, this is a brilliant script, you really need to read it. And Macy did, and met up with Anderson and thought, you're mad, you're going to actually try and get this film made. And Anderson then showed Macy Hard 8, and that sealed it. Macy was in. Louis Guzman, I have to give a name check to him. I think he's brilliant. He actually let the script sit for several months without reading it. It was just sat at the bottom of the pile. And when in the end he got hold of it, he rang Anderson up and got his way into the film. But perhaps the most notable piece of casting when it comes to Boogie Nights is the key role of Jack Horner, the older character in the film, really, the director of the adult movies that we see. And there were an assortment of names in the mix of this. And I mean, credit to Anderson's extensive DVD commentary and also to Film School Rejects that does wonderful summations of DVD commentaries as well. And it's from there we learned that Sidney Pollack had been offered that role, that Harvey Keitel had been sounded out about it. And I don't think either of them gave it particular shrift. Warren Beatty was interested for a while, and that would have been a real coup, but when you cast Warren Beatty, you get a couple of problems. Number one, Warren Beatty is notoriously indecisive. It takes him a long time to commit to a project. In fact, it takes him a long time to give you even a no, even for him to turn your project down. And Anderson would say that over time he realised that Beatty was more interested in the role of Dirk Diggler, but Dirk Diggler was a much younger role, and so Beatty wouldn't have really fitted it. And so Burt Reynolds came into the frame. Now, Reynolds at this stage, I mean, in the early 1980s, Burt Reynolds was the biggest movie star on the planet. I talked in a previous episode of this podcast of the Cannonball Run, where he was given a salary of a then unheard of $5 million for just a small amount of work in that movie. Such was the power of his name. By the time Paul Thomas Anderson got to him, well, his career was back in the doldrums, really, a series of not particularly good films, and his box office appeal was all but gone. And, I mean, let's go to the late Burt Reynolds' own memoir, But Enough About Me, where he talks about coming to Boogie Nights. And he admits in that, which, I mean, when you consider his subsequent comments about the film, Boogie Nights revived my career, but he also admitted I did my best not to do it. And so he describes how in 1997, a 27-year-old director named Paul Thomas Anderson called to say he was making a film about the porn industry and that he wanted me to play Jack Horner, a director of adult films. He said, I thought that glamorising pornography was a terrible idea, and I told him so, but he kept calling and I kept turning him down. And finally, just to get rid of him, I agreed to a meeting. He came to my hotel room and I said, look, you don't get it. The answer is no. He made a smart-ass remark and I blew up. And at the end of my tirade, he said, if you can do that in the movie, you'll get nominated for an Academy Award. And Reynolds admits at that stage, he was as much impressed by by the composure of the man as to what he actually said. And so Reynolds he agreed to sign on the dotted line. Names such as Robert De Niro and Sean Penn had also been in the running for roles there. One person who was less impressed was Samuel L. Jackson. He was offered the role of Buck Swope in the movie. He quickly turned that down. And Don Cheadle got the offer instead. Lots of country and western music in this film for Don Cheadle as well. And it was Julianne Moore's recommendation, really, that he agreed to sign on the dotted line. And so it was all in place. He had a large ensemble cast. He was going to shoot this in and around Los Angeles, and Anderson had got the creative control he desired. What could possibly go wrong? Now, filming on this one would begin, slightly clashing with Burt Reynolds' version of events in his book, on the 10th of July 1996, and it was shooting in and around the California area, and Anderson knew what he wanted with this one. He was a great believer, and he'd written the script, and he wanted to film the script, and he wasn't going to go off-piste with that, but he also knew he had some ambitious footage he wanted to get. So the opening shot that we see in the film is a long Steadicam shot, a continuous tracking shot that took 7 takes to get, and took 12 hours of a day just to land that in the first place. He also was very adamant up front to his actors that he needed them to wrap their heads around acting badly, but not badly, because he pulled all of the main cast together and he told them, you're all really good actors, but the talent here is you're acting as actors who aren't really good actors in an adult movie, and in Anderson's words, it took real talent to be good at acting bad. Their locations included a seedy hotel. Paul Thomas Anderson's dad's house pops up at one point, local LA neighborhood. And they also used a small film studio in the California area as well. But getting the look of this, I mean, this is a 1970s into 1980s film. And so the production design was leaning on looks that they found in 1970s magazines. And the costumes were done that way as well. With the brilliant Philip Seymour Hoffman. How missed is he? I mean, the costume design for him is deliberate deliberately him trying to dress as a 14-year-old. That was how they decided to posit that particular character. In the midst of all of this, one name to drop in is a director called Adam Shankman, who's just directed the film Disenchanted at the point this has been released, but he's got several directorial credits to his name himself at the moment. But here he was coming in to choreograph the 1970s dancing scenes, and they decided to explore all the extremes of what disco dancing in the 70s could look like. Great big pool party in the midst of this as well. The only problem with that is, again, they filmed that for real. Temperature in the area was going up over 100 degrees Fahrenheit the day they did it, and there were people reportedly on the edge of getting heat strokes. Such was the intensity of the sun that they were filming in the midst of. But I think, the stories that really characterise the shooting of Boogie Nights are those of disagreements and the friction between Paul Thomas Anderson and, in particular, Burt Reynolds. And so it would be fair to say, they were starting to clash. That the styles of the pair were not meshing at all. That Anderson wanted to do the script, Reynolds wanted a bit more freedom to explore the role, and Reynolds was getting more and more, let's just say, unhappy and less comfortable with the material. Now, the irony of all of this is he gives one of the best performances of his career in the movie, but I think in this case it was an issue that neither managed the other one well. And so, as Reynolds would say, we had disagreements, but none of them were his fault. They were mine. I just couldn't say the lines he wanted me to say. I couldn't say, okay, what's that say? Clucker in the class. Who knows? And so he said, I asked for a meeting with Paul and our producer, John Lyons. I said, I don't think I can deliver that line. And Anderson just, we'll be here until you can. This was a hard as nails, terrible phrase in this context, 20-something director who knew what he wanted. But Reynolds was adamant. It's just like, can't we do it another way? No, I like it the way it is. And Reynolds said, where did this hard ass come from? And he said, I tried to reason with him. He said, I can say the line, but I don't think I can say it very well because I'm not comfortable with it. And I thought that since you wrote it, you might have another way of doing it. And apparently Anderson said to Burt Reynolds, formerly the biggest movie star in the world, no, I don't. You'll have to find a way to say it as it's written. It's what you were hired for. Now, Reynolds would also add that he was proud of the performances in the movie. He also had a bit of a spat with Thomas Jane, who takes on a role in this film as well. And he said on the first day of rehearsal, he was getting physical with people. And he said, when he put his martial arts moves on me, I said, don't make the mistake of pushing me because I pushed back. And there were reports that Reynolds' temper wasn't particularly calm throughout certain parts of the filming of this. At the heart of it all was the performance from Mark Wahlberg as well. And there was one key scene, I'm not spoiling the film if you've not seen it, that it was building up to, involving Mark Wahlberg's nether regions that were going to require a bit of exaggerating, I would say, to the point where he was fitted with prosthetics that were matched to his skin tone and his skin colour, and there's really nothing else I can tell you about that bit of the story that won't get me one of those explicit marks over on iTunes and thus lead me into commercial doom. Let's just say it took quite a lot of work to get the contents of his underpants right. I think that's fair, but as this is a family podcast, I will move on and just say filming wrapped up on the 7th of October 1996, and Anderson headed into the edit suite for the movie, where again he had control of the film. That he could deliver the cut that he wanted to do, and he duly did. Interestingly, though, even though he was adamant that he was going to make a 3-hour film, the cut that he in the end delivered fell some way short of that. 2 hours 35, 2 hours 36, the final running time of Boogie Nights. However, that when he started showing his rough cut of the movie, well, it wasn't going down very well. And the editor on this one, Dylan Tickener, it was his first film as a solo editor. And he had to work with the fact that Anderson as well was very keen to not budge on his view of the film, that he'd gone through that experience on Sydney where he'd lost control of it. And here, as people were complaining about the movie, Anderson was sort of digging in a little bit. And so, Burt Reynolds, for one, when he saw a cut of the film, was not happy. And it's a fairly famous story that he fired his agent not long afterwards. Such was his level of dissatisfaction with getting involved with that film. New Line wasn't happy with the film either. It wasn't happy with the length of the film. The first cut of it didn't go down well. And so it took some persuading for Anderson to take another look at it. And the editing took several months on this one. Test screenings were taking place. They were not going well either. The scores that were coming in from the test screenings were low. People were walking out. Others were hating it. But as Anderson reconciled, how can you test screen this movie? How can you do it? This isn't like a big commercial film. And if you let the test screening audience knock the edges off it, well, sort of what are you left with, really? At one stage, one of the bosses at New Line was said to have overseen a cut of the film themselves that, let's just say, that didn't go down well with Anderson either. That was just running to just above 2 hours. And then the Motion Picture Association of America wasn't happy either. But it was quite interesting that the main problem that the MPAA had were to do with violence. They were the description goes, they were hung up on a few of the naughty things, as the Grantland article goes into, things such as, quote, humping, clenching butt cheeks. And they would say Dirk's butt while he's having sex with Amber, too much. And so they'd go back and they'd cut 20 frames of Mark Wahlberg's backside out of it, and they'd send it back, and then they cut another few frames and another few frames. And in the end, it went backwards and forwards to the MPAA 18 times, which at the time was said to have been a record. Still, Anderson was still in control of the film, and for the $15 million that New Line was spending on it, he was giving them a lot for their money, not least the amount of music that he wanted to underpin the movie with. It's telling that the film got 2 soundtrack CDs back when we had things like CDs, remember those? But New Line at one stage was thinking, well, we need to counter-program this. And this was not an unusual release strategy for independent or art house films. So the logic of this goes that if there's a massive release in cinemas, that's going to mop up the vast bulk of the audience. But if you provide an alternative, then that might drag some people in as well, that you counter-program against the big movie. Now, the problem was that New Line was initially thinking of positioning Boogie Nights against the second Jurassic Park film, The Lost World, in the summer of 1997. And the first Jurassic Park film had been one of the biggest films of all time. No one quite knew what the second one was going to turn out like at that point. Short of, Steven Spielberg was back directing it. It was going to be big. Lots of people were going to see it. And so the New Line was eventually dissuaded from this and settled on a release date for Boogie Nights in October of 1997 instead. Now, the film would debut at the Toronto International Film Festival a month before, in the September of that year. And the response to it was really strong, actually. It was pretty much strong from the off. That inevitably the subject matter put a couple of people off, but most of the big critics in America were really going for it. They were praising Mark Wahlberg, they were praising Julianne Moore, they were praising Anderson, and they were particularly praising arguably the person in the ensemble who disliked the film the most, Burt Reynolds. And so New Line, pressed ahead with the release of it, and off it went into cinemas. And it went on a staged release, really, that it was going to do a staggered opening. Not uncommon, as we've talked about lots of times on this podcast, for smaller films. You open it on a couple of screens and try and build up the audience over a number of weeks. And so the weekend of October the 10th to the 12th, 1997, Boogie Nights is found for the first time in the US box office chart in 19th place, playing on only 2 screens with a massive screen average. And it grossed $50,000, $50,168 if you want to be exact, on 2 screens. And so these were the kind of numbers that were encouraging to New Line. The number 1 film that weekend was Kiss the Girls, the Morgan Freeman headlined thriller. 7 Years in Tibet had just come out as well. Rocket Man, but not that Rocket Man, a Disney version of Rocket Man was in at number 6. The movies that were around at this point were also LA Confidential was in the top 10. The Edge, which I'm coming to on a future episode of the podcast, is in there too. But the test would be whether Boogie Nights could sustain an audience and sustain a screen average if they upped the screen count. So the week after, they knocked it up to 30 screens. Then the per average went up again, even as competitions such as I Know What You Did Last Summer and The Devil's Advocate and the first Mr. Bean movie came out. The rolling out into even more screens, well, it was on 124 screens by the third week, but that screen average was just starting to drop as Gattaca opened in 5th place that week. Boogie Nights still hadn't broken the top 10, but it would in week 4 when New Line finally put it on 900 screens. It added 4.6 million to its box office gross. The big new opener that weekend was the Richard Gere headline thriller Red Corner. And there was a feeling that Boogie Nights might have something of an Oscar run because its box office wasn't going to set the world alight. They knew that. Subject matter was tricky. The word of mouth was great. And in fact, its US gross in the end just petered out at $26.4 million. Now, that was a success for New Line, that it hadn't spent that much on the film. And it was in the conversation for Academy Awards. In fact, for lots of awards at that stage. But when it came to the Oscars, it got 3 nominations. So Best Supporting Actor for Burt Reynolds, Best Supporting Actress for Julianne Moore, and Best Screenplay, written directly for the screen, for Paul Thomas Anderson. Now, it had won an assortment of critics' awards to that point. This would be the only Oscar nomination of the late Burt Reynolds' career. And to this day, the suspicion is the fact that he came out in the aftermath of the movie's release and was so critical of the film cost him an Academy Award. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, because Robin Williams prevailed that year. He won for Good Will Hunting. But Reynolds would tell The Guardian many years later that he just ended up hating Paul Thomas Anderson at the time, to the point where he turned down a role in Magnolia. And he talked about on Oscar night as well when he lost and how he wanted to lock himself away. And this is from his memoir. And a friend of his, John Voight, they'd worked on films together, of course, called to commiserate, he said, but per my instructions, the switchboard at the hotel wouldn't put him through. John being John, wrote Reynolds, he came to the hotel, borrowed a waiter's uniform and carried a room service tray into the room. He said, I was in bed with my face in a book, didn't notice him until he threw himself on the bed and kissed me square on the mouth. He said, it shocked me out of my funk, and I said that right, and we spent the rest of the night laughing. Now, Reynolds would soften some of his words on the film in the years before his death. In fact, Mark Wahlberg in 2017 was the one who came out and made some comments that suggested he wasn't particularly keen on it anymore. A man of faith, he gave an interview where he said that he hoped that God would forgive him. I'm paraphrasing this, God would forgive him for making the film. But again, the internet took hold of that, and Wahlberg just said that he clarified in an interview with People that I was sitting in front of a couple of thousand kids talking about and trying to encourage them to come back to their faith. And I was just saying that I just hope God has a sense of humour, because I maybe made some decisions that may not be okay with him. Because for Wahlberg, Boogie Nights put him on the map as a serious actor, no question whatsoever, and it was the catalyst for his movie star career. For Paul Thomas Anderson, meanwhile, he'd done this absolute bravado piece of work, and I love the film Boogie Nights. New Line hadn't lost money, had got Oscar nominations off the back of it, and so when he presented them with a project called Magnolia, New Line was keen to take that one forward as well. I've covered that one in a previous episode of the podcast, though. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. I'm just going to do a couple of parish notices before I get to the second film. If you like this podcast, there are 3 ways you can support it. You can find me at Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew. And if you put a couple of pounds in the meter there, you can get this podcast advertising free. Also, you find out the gossip of what we're up to. You get behind the scenes info. You get the podcast that we do early. Then the money that we take from the Patreon, we reinvest into paying new writers and getting them involved with the Film Stories project as well. We try and give opportunities to people who've not been paid for writing before. Costing you no money whatsoever is just subscribe to the podcast at your podcast home of choice. That helps enormously and is hugely appreciated. Likewise, if you don't mind, leave a hugely positive review as well. All of these things are gold dust to independent podcasts. Finally, you can find all of our magazines for sale at store.filmstories.co.uk. We've got some terrific deals going at the moment just for the end of 2022, and hopefully you can support what we're trying to do there. Without further ado, though, I think that's enough parish notices, isn't it? I'm going to go to the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. Now, this one did win Oscars. This one also is terrific. I'm going to play you a clip. We'll come to the story the other side of this.
Step over to the office and get the bullwhip.
A whipping? That's all they get after what they've done? Get out of there!
It was a matter of honor.
They're paying $1,000 to whatever kills the 2 boys that cut up Delilah.
in a time when lawmen were killers.
What are y'all looking at?
You English, Bob?
Outlaws were heroes.
Well, I thought that you were dead.
Hell, I even thought I was dead. Till I found out I was just in Nebraska.
And a bad reputation
You're the one who killed William Harvey and robbed that train over Missouri?
was as good as gold.
My guess is you're calling yourself Mr. William Money.
Say what?
Well, say Unforgiven, the 1992 Western, directed by Clint Eastwood, written by David Webb Peoples, starring Eastwood, Gene Hackman, Morgan Freeman and Richard Harris in the quartet of lead roles. But this was a story of a film that famously its star waited a long time to make. So it begins with a man called David Webb Peoples. And so in the 1970s, he was working as a film editor, primarily across the likes of documentaries and news programmes. But on the side, he was also writing a few screenplays. Now, it'd be Ridley Scott who would give him his big break in that department, with the director bringing him in to co-write a small film called Blade Runner. I wonder what happened to that. But in the 1970s, Blade Runner was still some way off. And he wrote the first draft of what would become Unforgiven. And that was dated back to around 1976. And so it was a film that would take some time to sell. But the film ultimately got its catalyst and its way forward originally when Francis Ford Coppola took an option out on the screenplay in 1984. So we're already 8 years on in the story. Now, the script that Peoples had written, which was originally going by the name The Cut Horse Killings, that's cheery, isn't it? Would then migrate into The William Money Killings, and would then migrate into Unforgiven, was influenced in large part by Martin Scorsese's film Taxi Driver, not least the depiction of violence in that. And this was going to be a violent Western, but also it was going to be an anti-violence Western as well. However, as much as Coppola was interested in getting the film made, try as he might, he couldn't interest a Hollywood studio in signing a cheque to get the film made. Now, at this stage, Westerns weren't absolutely dead in Hollywood. I mean, there were Westerns going around at the time, like Silverado was that's a great film, that is. Clint Eastwood was making Pale Rider, not a million miles away from this time as well. But the genre was still on some degree of life support. And even though Coppola got to the point of sounding out an actor or two, I mean, John Malkovich was said to have been asked about the movie, his option would lapse without him being able to get it off the ground, and so it would go back into turnaround. The option would suddenly become available again. Now, in the end would come someone who absolutely could get a Western off the ground, Clint Eastwood. Now, he initially, as David Webb Peoples had discussed, when he came to the screenplay, talked about, I could make this in a year or two, but that wouldn't in the end prove to be the case. And as it turned out already, Eastwood had already nearly given the film a miss. Because one of the people that Eastwood worked with on his films, a woman called Sonia Chernes, she was reading scripts on his behalf and writing memos recommending whether he should read them or give them a try or leave them. It would be fair to say she was absolutely not a fan of the William Money Killings. She wrote a scathing memo that firmly recommended he completely gave it a swerve. She described the film as, quote, a disgrace. And in the end, Eastwood would hang this memo that she sent in his office at Warner Brothers, where his production company was based. But at that stage, that was enough to put him off just picking up the screenplay and giving it a read. Now, in the end, the reason he did read it, as the story goes, was that he was looking for a screenwriter to work on another project he was working on. So he picked this up and had a look, and he was really, really taken with the project, and he wanted in, and so he took out his option in 1985. But even at that stage, even with the talk that I could get this going in a year or two, he wasn't really in a rush. That Eastwood was always juggling a fair amount of projects, and as much as he's a prolific filmmaker and has been pretty much up to this day, there were other things that he was toying with as well. And he was also eyeing up the idea of playing the lead character in this one too. But the problem he faced was, this wasn't the era of Martin Scorsese Scorsese's The Irishman, for instance, where you could use digital technology to age or de-age people and make it look convincing. He knew in his heart of hearts he needed to be older to make the central character work. This is a Western where it's someone towards the end of their life who's seen everything, who is responding to that and responding to the culture of violence around them, and he wasn't quite ready at that point to take the plunge on him. I mean, he also put Westerns to the side after the film Pale Rider as well, and by his standards he had a little bit of a slowdown. That for 15 years to this point, while his production company was set up at Warner Brothers, by the time he got to 1991, that was only the third of those 15 years he didn't have a film out for the studio. Other than that, he'd been reliably making a film a year. But he'd just come off the back of a project that had involved a lot of location filming, that had been a bit more complex than some of his previous movies, called White Hunter Black Heart. That had taken a time toll, so Eastwood was still working. It's just that he couldn't fit another project in any quicker than he did. However, by the time we get to 1991 and by the time we get to the aftermath of White Hunter Black Heart, Hollywood's reluctance over Westerns was beginning to turn. And one of the key reasons for that was Kevin Costner's film Dances with Wolves that he starred in and directed, that had walked off with 7 Academy Awards and also over $150 million at the American box office alone. As Eastwood would tell NJ.com, he said, everybody wants to pronounce genres dead. Then somebody comes along with a new twist and changes everything. And Hollywood's eyes had reopened to the fact that Westerns could make an awful lot of money. And as he would describe the Unforgiven script, he said, I put it in a drawer for 10 years. He said, I'd done a bunch of Westerns. I thought I should do some other things first. Then 10 years later, I picked it up and reread it, and it felt fresh. This is all charted in an interview with Douglas Thompson in the book Clint Eastwood, the biography of cinema's greatest ever star. But he also said a good story is a good story, and you can't be afraid of it. He said, you can't be an actor in the first place if you're afraid. You can't be afraid of failure, can't be afraid of falling on your face. It's all a crapshoot anyway. And he knew he could make this film relatively economically anyway. Warner Brothers was going to back him to make pretty much any film that he wanted. And he reconciled, I never thought it would make money. I just thought that this was a story I wanted to tell. My conclusion as to what the Western mythology is. And so he picked it as his next film. And by 1991, this one was motoring. Now, as always with Eastwood, it comes together relatively quickly, but the casting was still taking a little bit of work. So Morgan Freeman takes a role in this one, and he heard about the project while he was shooting Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves at the end of 1990, that Kevin Costner reportedly told him about it, and then Freeman got in touch with Eastwood, and a role was sorted out at that point. Now, Eastwood also notably doesn't audition actors who've got a prominent body of work. He'll just go and watch their work. And so he centred on the people that he wanted, one of whom was Richard Harris. And so Harris gave an interview before he died where he talked about how he happened to be watching one of Eastwood's films, High Plains Drifter, good film that, when Eastwood called to offer him a role in Unforgiven. And Harris, like most people to it, was wary of doing such a violent film. But also, Eastwood persuaded him it was actually an anti-violence movie. And Harris, in the end, also reconciled that, just want to be in a Clint Eastwood film. That's pretty cool, right? Also, Gene Hackman was another who was pushing back against the violence in it. Regular listeners of this podcast will remember that Gene Hackman was close to directing and starring in The Silence of the Lambs at one point before he got cold feet over the levels of violence in that film. But in the case of Unforgiven, as much as he was a little bit worried about it, he read the script. He got what it was going for. He turned the film down before Eastwood had got involved at one point. But with Eastwood on board and with the assurances in place, Hackman did agree to take on one of the key roles in the movie. And then, of course, Eastwood was going to take this lead part. And so the film was set up as usual at Warner Brothers. A budget of about $14 million for this one. Because of the haste at which it came together in the end, after such a long wait to dig the script out of Eastwood's drawer, there was only really a 2-month pre-production time to get everything up and running, to get the actors trained, to work with horses, to get the set built as well. And so it was fast moving once it was going. But on August the 26th, 1991, filming would begin on Unforgiven. Now, one person who was absent from the filming of the movie was David Webb Peoples, who at this stage hadn't even met Clint Eastwood, even though Eastwood had sort of been in his life for, well, several years to this stage, but he wouldn't interfere with the filming of it. And so if Eastwood decided to run roughshod over the script, well, Webb Peoples couldn't do anything about it. And in fact, they'd only actually meet after filming was done. But also, Eastwood would end up shooting pretty much everything that was written. And so the story there, I mean, Frances Fisher, who's one of the supporting cast in this, she'd tell the Los Angeles Times that it's the only time that to this stage where she'd been filming a movie and the shooting script of it was all on white pages. And this was important because originally a script starts as white pages, and then as the rewrites come in, they're color coded. And so you generally get a kind of kaleidoscopic rainbow coloured screenplay with all the rewritten pages in there. But what had happened here is Eastwood admitted that he'd gone and taken a look at it and tried reworking some parts of the Unforgiven script and then realised he wasn't improving it. And he went back to the original, changing barely a comma of the script that David Webb Peoples had written. Now, the film would shoot for the first time for Eastwood in Canada, and that was due to a bending of the rules that his regular cinematographer, Jack N. Green, and Eastwood had a regular collection of crew and filmmakers that he worked with. Well, Jack N. Green was working in Canada on another project and got talking to people there and was asked, why hasn't Clint Eastwood ever filmed here? Has he got any plans? And it's just like, well, no, he hasn't, because Green explained Eastwood couldn't film in Canada because of the rules in place meant he couldn't bring his family along with him. Now, what this meant was his film family, the 50 to 60 people who he liked to make films with. He worked with the same people over and over and over again. And as the story goes, when the official in question understood what Eastwood's family actually was, that it was this bunch of filmmakers, a deal was put forward. And the deal was that if you could prove you'd worked with Clint Eastwood on more than 5 films, you're more than welcome to come to Canada, and you wouldn't have to abide by the union's work rules that were restricting who Eastwood was otherwise able to bring. And of course, all these people had worked with Eastwood for a very long time, and it turned out that Unforgiven was able to bend the rules, and that's how it ended up in Alberta. Now, the production designer on this one was a man called Henry Bumstead, and he was tasked with building an 1880s western town. Now, this was some 50, 60 miles away from the nearest city. The nearest big town was Calgary, and so they knew that they were going to spend a lot of time on this location. And so two things on it. First of all, with a nod to Hitchcock's Rear Window here, that lots of the buildings that you see in Unforgiven are actually fully functioning buildings. That ordinarily when a set is built, you see the facade, you see what the camera sees, and there's not much going on behind there, but they did actually put buildings up that they could use for this one. The second thing was that cars were banned from the set of this one, that even though you were off remotely in the Alberta area, you weren't allowed to drive your vehicle in and around the set at all, that they were just making it sacrosanct, really. Now, Eastwood, as a director, by reputation and by legend, is a man of very, very few takes. If you dig right back into our archive to the episode I did on A Perfect World, there's a story of how he and Kevin Costner didn't exactly see eye to eye on that, because Costner wanted more takes and Eastwood just wants to get moving and move on. And there have been articles written about just how when you're shooting an Eastwood film, it's all in the preparation, that there's a whole hive of activity to get ready for the shot, and then Eastwood will come in, take 1 or 2 takes and just move on. And in this case, one of the key scenes in the movie, one pivotal scene in the movie, he actually shot the rehearsal as well. Without telling anyone, he'd turned the camera on, and it's the rehearsal that ends up in the final cut of the movie. This efficiency contributed to the fact that Unforgiven came in under budget, it came in early, and would wrap up on November the 12th, 1991, with Eastwood making noises at this stage that this would be his last Western, and in fact the last time that he would star in a film, perhaps, the last time he'd direct, although he was also set to shoot the late Wolfgang Petersen's directed thriller In the Line of Fire, which again I've covered before. In the case of putting Unforgiven together, though, I mean, he edited as efficiently as always, working again with his regular editor, Joel Cox. The score for this one was being done by Lenny Niehaus. However, Eastwood was contributing more and more music to his films, and the main theme that you hear in the score, the beautiful score to Unforgiven, well, Eastwood Eastwood penned that main theme as well. We're not quite at the level of Gran Torino with him growling out with gravel the final song across the end credits. Instead, it was just like this really understated piece of music that runs right throughout the movie. Eastwood would also add a dedication to the end of the film to Sergio Leone and Don Siegel, two legendary directors who've been absolutely pivotal in his career, and this film was a tribute of sorts to them. It was just being seen as the end of not just Eastwood's return to the Western, but him leaving the Western behind as well. And when he completed his final cut, Eastwood then would bring in David Webb Peoples, who would finally see the completed movie, would finally meet Clint Eastwood, and let's just say I don't think there was any kind of falling out there. They seemed to get on well, and both could really have few complaints as to how the film had ended up, because Warner Brothers was debuting this in August of 1992, August the 3rd of 1992. It premiered before a wider release later in the week. The critical response to this was absolutely ecstatic. Absolutely ecstatic. A real turning point in Clint Eastwood's career as a director, that he'd done a bunch of pulpy stuff, he'd done some thriller stuff, he'd done some serious films, but this was just elevated. This was felt to be an absolute crowning moment of a career. The reviews were so strong that it was felt there's going to be an Oscar run here. And so it was interesting to see, would audiences nonetheless turn out to see a Western? Because as much as Dances with Wolves had done the business, there were few that had massively followed in its path, even though it's only a year or two on. Unforgiven, though, opened at number one at the box office, and August the 7th to the 9th, 1992. So really savvy programming by Warner Brothers there, outside of the rest of the blockbuster field. And so it knocked Death Becomes Her off the top of the chart. I've covered that before as well. Brian De Palma's Raising Cain, that's an interesting film. The first Three Ninjas film, known as Three Ninja Kids here in the UK, fact fans. But Unforgiven was comfortably the number one film that week. $15 million. More than its production budget, appreciating that there's still distribution costs and marketing costs to pay for. When Single White Female opened the week after, the thriller Single White Female, a big commercial thriller, that couldn't dislodge it, even though it helped itself to 10 million. Unforgiven found another 11 million. Its audience just wasn't dropping at all. Week 3, still at number 1, even though the Brandon Lee headlined Rapid Fire came along and Christopher Columbus, The Discovery, came along. There was Unforgiven, only in the end displaced at the end of August by the Nicolas Cage headlined Honeymoon in Vegas, which is kind of like Indecent Proposal, but a comedy with more Elvis Presleys in it. The thing was, though, Unforgiven was just kept chugging along. It wasn't doing gigantic numbers week in, week out, but it was hanging around in the charts. And the awards momentum was really building up for this one as well. And so by the time it actually finished its run in cinemas, Unforgiven had earned Warner Brothers $101 million just in the US alone, surprisingly adding another $58 million outside of the US for a genre that was felt to be American-centric. But also come award season, this one was heavily in the running. The nominations came in for the Oscars in great numbers. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor, Best Screenplay, the art direction, the cinematography, the film editing, the sound. And Eastwood, as a filmmaker, had always felt really frozen out by the Oscars. He was more of a commercial filmmaker. This wasn't really his kind of environment. And yet here he found himself nominated against films like Howard's End and The Crying Game and A Few Good Men and Scent of a Woman. And as Jack Nicholson took the stage that night at the 65th Academy Awards with the envelope in his hands to announce the Best Picture winner, I think few people watching had any doubt what was going to win by that stage. Already the film had picked up 3 Oscars. Gene Hackman had won for Best Supporting Actor. The Film Editing Prize had gone to Joel Cox, and Eastwood had an Oscar in his hand for the first time that he'd won for Best Director of the film as well. And Unforgiven was announced as the Best Picture winner. Now, this would, it would help the box office, certainly, but also it would help really build a fresh stage of Clint Eastwood's career in the aftermath of Unforgiven's win, because he's the films that he then started to make, well, all of a sudden, after barely interesting the Oscars previously, he was making a whole bunch of films that were very much going to interest the Academy Awards in the years that followed. Now, he completed his commitment to In the Line of Fire, first of all. That would go on to be a big hit the following summer. He made A Perfect World with Kevin Costner, which underperformed at the box office, but I think it's a delight of a film. But it's films like The Bridges of Madison County that he made for Steven Spielberg's company that attracted Oscar attention. He made a few thrillery commercial films like Absolute Power and True Crime and Space Cowboys and Blood War, but it was Mystic River that again brought him to the attention of the Academy Awards, and he would win Best Director Oscar again in 2004 for $1 Million Baby. His films Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, they would also attract Oscar attention too. And the films that he was making after he won his Academy Awards would be a real balance of the commercial stuff and also the more awards, the kind of films that interested awards a lot more. For Unforgiven, though, its reputation seems fairly cemented in American film history, not least to date, even though Eastwood has directed a lot more, even though he has acted a lot more, it remains his final Western, and it is likely to remain his final Western as well. There is a school of thought, even appreciating this is contextualised against the likes of the spaghetti Westerns, that it is its finest. I certainly think it's a film that stands up there with them. And if you've never had the pleasure, do check it out. Which all brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. Our website is filmstories.co.uk. There's movie news, reviews, features going up there every single weekday. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can buy magazine subscriptions, individual issues, our sneakers Blu-ray as well. As I said, lots of offers going on there. We've got a whole bunch of live events we're going to be announcing in due course as well, running right the way through 2023. The first, I can tell you, will be in Birmingham, a Movie Geek live show at Birmingham here in the UK on the 18th of January. We're setting that for tickets going on sale soon. And I think that's it, really. I think I've thoroughly bored you enough. The most important thing, as always, is you all look after yourselves and you all take care. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Bye-bye.